everybody. Thank you for joining us for the virtual Tulane Alumni Travel Faculty Lecture. I'm Lori Hurwitz. I'm the Associate Vice President for Alumni Relations here at Tulane. Before we get started, I want to remind everyone to please mute your audio. We will have time for questions at the end of Professor Lopez's lecture, so you can submit those through the chat, but be prepared because I may call on you to ask them yourselves. It is my honor to introduce Professor Ana M. Lopez of the Department of Communication and the School of Liberal Arts. Worth noting that we are honored that as of this year, she's also an honorary alumna of the university, elected by the Board of Directors for the Tulane Alumni Association. In her lecture tonight, Professor Lopez will take us on a journey through the history of Cuba in an attempt to better understand its presence. Dr. Ana Lopez is Professor of Communication in the School of Liberal Arts, Associate Provost for Faculty Affairs, and Director of the Cuban and Caribbean Studies Institute at Tulane University. Her research is focused on Latin American and Latino film and cultural studies. She is the co-editor of the Routledge Companion to Latin American Cinema and the editor-in-chief of the Intellects Journal, Studies in Spanish and Latin American Cinemas. She is also the author of the collection of essays Hollywood, Nuestra America y los Latinos, and co-editor of 3 collections of essays on Latin American cinema, She has published more than 36 essays and book chapters addressing topics that range from melodrama and performance in the golden age cinemas of Latin America, early silent cinema and modernity, and documentary to telenovelas, Cuban American media, and intermediality. Please join me in welcoming Professor Lopez.
Thank you, Lori. I truly appreciate being here and having the opportunity to speak to you all. As Lori mentioned, about a week ago, I still intended to follow sort of like the description that Lori presented of what my talk's going to be about, a trip to Cuba through its history in order to understand its present. Literally until last weekend, this is what I thought I was going to do. But I'm actually going to end up skipping over the lovely 12 or 14 slides I had prepared about that history and its intimate ties, Cuba's intimate ties to Louisiana and its culture, with all sorts of lovely facts and illustrations. And I'm actually going to focus on what's been happening this week. I actually don't think most of you who have logged in today are really interested. Well, perhaps you're interested, perhaps you would have been interested, but I think what's more prescient today, it's to talk about what's going on. So by way of introduction to what is happening in Cuba right now, in 1921, in July 1921, I am going to show you a short video.
Y eres tú mi canto de sirena, porque con tu voz se van mis penas. Y este sentimiento ya es tan viejo, tú me dueles tanto aunque estés lejos. Hoy yo te invito a caminar por mi solar, para demostrarte de que sirven tus ideales. Somos humanos aunque no pensemos iguales, no nos tratemos ni dañemos como animales. Esta es mi forma de decírtelo. Llora mi pueblo y siento yo su voz. Tu 59, yo doble 2, 60 años, trancado el dominó. Pongo el platillo a los 500 de La Habana, mientras en casa las cazuelas ya no tienen jama. Que celebramos si la gente anda deprisa, cambiando Che Guevara, llama al tipo la divisa. Todo ha cambiado, ya no es lo mismo. Entre tú y yo hay un abismo. Publicidad, un paraíso, un varadero, mientras las madres lloran por sus hijos que se fueron. Se acabó. Un 59, yo doble 2. Ya se acabó. 60 años, trancado el dominó, mira. Se acabó. Un 59, yo doble 2. Ya se acabó. 60 años, trancado el dominó. Somos artistas, somos sensibilidad. La historia verdadera, no la mal contada. Somos la dignidad de un pueblo entero pisoteada. A punta de pistola y de palabras que hoy son nada. No más mentiras, respeto. Se acabó. Y no tenemos miedo, se acabó el engaño. Ya se acabó. Ay, eso se sentido haciendo daño. Aquí vivimos con la incertidumbre del pasado plantado. 15 amigos puestos, listos para morirnos. Izamos la bandera todavía. La represión del régimen ardía. Ana Meli Ramos firme con su poesía. Omar Ripustiola dándonos aliento de vida. Rompieron nuestra puerta, violaron nuestro templo. Y el mundo está consciente de que el movimiento San Isidro continúa puesto. En la misma, la seguridad metiendo prisma. Esas cosas que como me indignan. Se acabó el enigma de esa tu revolución maligna. Soy funky style y aquí tienen mi firma. Y ustedes están sobrando, ya no les queda nada, ya se van bajando. El pueblo se cansó de estar aguantando. Un nuevo amanecer estamos esperando. Se acabó. Ya se acabó. 60 años, donde no me se acabó. 5-9 con ya se acabó. 60 años, practicando vigor. 60 años, practicando vigor.
So that video was released in February 2021. A reaction by a very well-known group of Cuban artists, particularly the 3 who are based outside of Cuba. 2 of them are based in Cuba, so there was actually some very creative photoshopping of the ones that are in Cuba to incorporate them with the ones that are not. So it's a reaction of these artists to the events of what is known as the San Isidro movement. The San Isidro movement goes back to 2018, and it emerged as a reaction to a new law that required that artistic activity had to have permission from the Ministry of Culture before performances could be enacted or art displayed. There had to be an official approval process. Its name, San Isidro, references the neighborhood in Havana where several of its members, in particular the reggaeton artist, the musician Denis Soler and Luis Manuel Otero Alcántara, who's a performance artist, the neighborhood where both of them lived. In August 2019, there's a lot of protests fueled by social media posts. There's a call from the performance artist, in particular Otero Alcántara, because he had been censured for a performance in which he wrapped himself in the Cuban flag. So he asked the people to go out and wrap themselves in Cuban flags. And images appeared all over social media of Cubans in Cuba wrapped in Cuban flags. Not a very common sight. In November of the following year, 10 members of the group locked themselves in a house in San Isidro, protesting the imprisonment of Daniel Solis. And actually that imprisonment had been filmed using a phone, and it had been live streamed. And they went into a hunger strike which lasted about 10 days. And they streamed constantly from inside the house until the police forcibly entered and took them away with the excuse that it was because of COVID and because they were not maintaining proper masking, social distancing, what have you. The next day, a protest, apparently rather spontaneous protest, appeared in front of the Cuban Ministry of Culture with actually hundreds of very notable cultural workers, for lack of a better name, artists, writers, filmmakers, very well-established cultural figures, joining the demands of the San Isidro people, the San Isidro guys, for a dialogue. Lots of promises were made. The Vice Minister of Culture came out and met and talked to the protesters, and there were many promises of dialogue, none of which were kept. So, hold on, gotta get to my next slide. So these are some images of the events. Here in the bottom right, you have the flag the people wrapped in flags, and these are all images that appear in social media. This is the on the top right, a group of the original folks that went into the hunger strike. On the upper left is images taken by their friends outside the house as they watched government representatives circle the house and begin its attack. And down here below is another picture of the participants. And here is a picture which is very posed, but it was taken by a New York Times photographer. The New York Times does have a representative in Cuba. That's a Ministry of Culture, and those are the folks, a group picture of the folks that protested the next day after the San Isidro folks were removed. And this one looks a little bit more spontaneous. But again, it's published by the New York Times. The picture was published by the New York Times. So, Patria y Vida, the video I showed you, and its title, as well as the refrain for the song, is a spin on the revolutionary slogan that has been circulating since the late 1950s, before actually January 1st, 1959, and the so-called triumph of the revolution, right? It's a spin on Patria o Muerte, which was the slogan for the 26th of July movement, which is the movement that led to Fidel's, organized by Fidel, and that led to the beginning of, quote unquote, the revolution in January 1st, 1959, homeland or death. In other words, we will defend our right to our homeland until dead. That has been the slogan that has ruled Cuban cultural to some degree, but mostly, of course, political life. We will defend our homeland until death. Our singers turn around, right? And all of a sudden, it's like, not death. We want homeland, but we want to live, right? And I think this is really an important reading of the shifts, of the changes that are taking place right before our eyes. The video was immediately very, very popular, the music video. By February, well, in February 2021, 3 days after it was released, it already had 3 million hits, and it has about 7 million hits now. Actually, this was a couple of days ago. It probably has more now. It's been taken out by Cubans and Cuban Americans alike. So we actually can, in all the images that have been circulating with the events in Cuba in the last few days, you can see signs saying Patria y Vida on both sides of the Florida Straits. So what's new about all this? I mean, it's been 62 years of the revolution, and we've seen historically, if we want to look at history, you know, several moments where there was social unrest in Cuba, in most cases very contained fairly quickly, or dissipated, such as the Balsero crisis, for example, when folks were just going on, getting on boats and just leaving, where they just said, okay, fine, leave. Or the Mariel boat lift, right? Where it was like, you want to leave? Okay, you folks from Florida, come and get them in your own boats and take them. What's new here is, first of all, the cultural sector reacting so loudly and so clearly, very united. That's very unusual. That historically, that just simply has not happened. The cultural sector, writers, filmmakers, artists, actors, actresses, tends to be conservative, has tended to be conservative, at least insofar as any kind of outright challenging of the status quo of the revolution in anything other than perhaps their art, okay, their artistic practice. Personally, they have not historically put themselves out as social activists. And now all of a sudden they're doing that. Patria y Vida is unusual too because of its very harsh political message, if you think about it, right? The constant refrain is, se acabó. It's over, right? It's finished. The silence has been broken. We're singing. There's an abyss between you and me. You have no idea what we are like, and we just want something different than you want. But the country is ours too. It's who told you that you had the right to the country. It's very, very harsh. And also what has added to, if you want to think about it as political cachet or social relevance of this particular video, is the immediate response by the Cuban government, which was rather ridiculous. The accusations were that these individuals, that these artists were mercenaries, that they were paid by the US and USAID, that one of them was a homosexual, that the other one was a male prostitute, that it was just simply, like fake news. And they also managed to produce their own video in response to the video, which I will not show you because it's actually one of the worst music videos ever made, in my humble opinion. Not just because I may disagree with its political message, it's just really bad. So let me do a little short flashback to facts and history for those of you who may not be tremendously familiar with the basic details of Cuba, the basic data on Cuba, right? We're talking about 11.5 million people in 2019. Cuba is 15 provinces with capital cities in each province, but Havana at 2.2 million is by far the largest. The second closest city is only Santiago, which is in the very eastern end of the island, and that has about 500,000 inhabitants. Obviously, it's a Marxist, Leninist, socialist, communist state, whatever you want to call it. It's its own brand and combination of all that, created by Fidel Castro. And after he became ill, his brother, Raul Castro, who was also an original revolutionary from the July 26th movement, took over until he also stepped down. And a civilian who's young, who's only about, I may get my age wrong, he's in his 60s, took over in 2018 as president, Miguel Díaz-Canel. An additional, of course, very interesting fact is that there's a large diasporic community. There are Cubans everywhere, actually, but the US has the largest component of Cuban Americans, about 2 million Cuban Americans. The history of Cuba is complex. It was a Spanish colony, and it fought many wars, actually, to gain its independence. So-called, I put it in quotes, because in 1898, the Cuban fight for independence from Spain was truncated by what we in America referred to as the Spanish-American War, right? A ship blew up and the US intervened in what had been a struggle between Cubans and Spanish. And that led to intervention of Cuba by the US until 1902, but then retaining a lot of power. The US retained a lot of power over Cuba in that period. It is known in Cuban historiography, between 1902 and 1959, that period is known as the Republic. January 1st, 1959, a struggle to overthrow a dictator that had been in power for about 10 years, a little less than 10 years. It began in 1953, was concluded on January 1st, 1959, when said dictator left the country and Fidel Castro's group, the July 26th movement, announced its victory. The victory of what appeared to have been a popular revolution, right? There were no hints of socialism, communism, or anything like that. But there were some very strong measures that began to be implemented that directly impacted American interests in the island, which led to the 1960 establishment of the blockade, the embargo against Cuba. And I'm not going to go into the details, but shortly thereafter, it led to a very much closer, increasingly closer relationship with the USSR, with the Soviet Union. The Soviet bloc eventually ended up actually being Cuba's primary source of economic stability and economic support until its collapse. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989 led to what is known as a special period in times of peace in the 1990s, particularly after 1991, which is a period of tremendous economic crisis and need and hunger and difficulty for the Cuban people. To make a long story short, that model, the economic model that had been dependent on the USSR is updated in the 2000s, in the early 2000s, in many ways via the introduction of some controlled capitalist values and the introduction of multiple currencies, of at least two currencies, although foreign currency was also in circulation somewhat. And again, skipping over decades, the next big significant moment, and I have it highlighted with those dark bars, is December 17th, 2014, when about a year into his second term, if I'm not mistaken, President Obama began the move to normalize relations with Cuba. Basically initiated a policy shift to move away from sanctions and toward engagement, right? Those changes including taking back the designation of Cuba as a state sponsor of international terrorism, the restoration of diplomatic relations, and the establishment of an embassy, a working embassy in Havana, which hadn't existed since the 1960s. Amendments to, an easing of restrictions on travel to Cuba by Americans and Cuban Americans, on remittances to Cuba, on trade and telecommunications, banking, financial services. All sorts of restrictions were eased and accomplished through amendments to basically the laws, the Cuban asset control regulations, the laws that control the embargo, which is administered by the Treasury Department, and also some other regulations administered by the Commerce Department. So the restoration of relations led to increased government-to-government engagement with over 20 bilateral agreements on all sorts of issues, numerous dialogues. I mean, issues like climate change and preserving the environment and the Florida Straits and all of that. It was a time of tremendous optimism in Cuba. And I happened to have gone to Cuba, I don't know, I was in Cuba throughout that period a bunch of times for different reasons, at least, you know, six or eight times in the years between 2014 and 2017, actually probably more like a dozen times. And it was the first time since the first time I went to Cuba, which was back in 1985, that I could actually sense a difference in the Cuban body politic, right? There was a visible sense of optimism and hope, even among young people who had been disenfranchised from the state for a long time. There was this sense of like, oh, well, perhaps I don't have to leave the country to make something of myself that I want to make of myself, right? Or to have opportunities that I don't seem to have here. And of course, that ended with Trump in 2017 when he began to tighten the embargo, and over, the years, increased sanctions to Cuba at all levels, making the embargo even more restraining and more damaging to Cuba than it had been before 2014. And including putting Cuba back on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. With all of that comes, the immediate impact of that, of course, was to severely limit Cuba's access to currency, because most of its economy had become dependent on tourism, primarily, and tourism from the US. And they get a lot of tourism from Europe, they get tourism from Canada a lot, and they're beginning to get tourism from China, a lot of that too, and the USSR, particularly to the city, to the beaches up in the north of the country. But with COVID in 2019 and the shutting down of tourism, the crisis just became, exponentially worse, leading to what is known as the monetary reorganization of 2021, a long delayed project to unify the currency of Cuba. So there'll be one currency, the Cuba peso, and not multiple currencies. There had been a tourist currency. There have been over the years since 1989, multiple currencies, and this just pulled everything together. However, the peso was tremendous. The peso is what Cuban workers earn, right? The other kind, the tourist currency, you only had access to if you were somehow involved in the tourist business, in relations with tourists. But the peso was remarkably devalued. So with the reorganization, this currency, this monetary reorganization has led to tremendous inflation. And with the lack of tourism and the lack of foreign currency, period, what is available for purchase or what can be available for sale has decreased exponentially. So some of you, I imagine a lot of you, have seen some of these images that have been flooding our television's coverage of what is going on in Havana, and obviously all over social media as well. These are for the most part images from TV. This one, well, you can see the logo is from NBC. This is something that is new, right? And we'll actually have a slide that talks about it in a minute, but I want you to look at this map. All the little red dots are where protests emerged on Sunday, roughly around the same time. The first was a little south of Havana in a small town called San Antonio de los Baños. A lot of Cubans now have access to the internet. It's not cheap, but it's not crazy expensive, and you can access the internet through your phone. So you don't need a computer, and it's fairly good. I mean, it's fairly stable. I have been able to have like Zoom conversations with people in Cuba before this easily. And then they started spreading. Everything was posted live on social media, on Facebook, on Twitter, everywhere. They spread, as you can see, all over the island. This is more pictures. This is actually from Havana, on the entrance to Old Havana, and this is in Old Havana. And then finally, this is actually in another location altogether. And these are the kinds of images that we were actually seeing most on Sunday, images taken with cell phones of crowds just that seem ready for, immediate combustion, spontaneous combustion. So why, right? There is, and these are not in no particular order, they're not prioritized. And that's really important to keep in mind. It is clear that we're dealing with a situation in Cuba where you have entrenched authoritarianism. It's been 62 years of a one-party state that has not made allowances or allowed or even permitted the discussion of any kind of other system that could be put in place or any kind of succession project. The economic hardships that I alluded to before as a result of the lack of foreign income and, made even worse by COVID, has led to apagones, power outs, intentional power outages, which go on for hours. This is something that happened already in the 1990s, and it's happening again with great frequency. You can imagine, those of you who are still in Louisiana, most of you are alums, you've lived through hurricanes and storms and what happens when we lose power, right? The first thing is the refrigerator and your food in the refrigerator. Well, when you have serious food insecurity and whatever you may have in the refrigerator took hours in food lines to get, if you lose that, if we lose a freezer of food full of food, we'll mourn, but we'll go to Rouse's the next day and start building up again. It's serious. It's very serious. Inflation that I mentioned before, and then COVID has brought to the fore the health disparities that had already been visible for the last couple of decades in Cuba. mean, Cuba in the 1980s spoke highly and was very proud of the fact that it had one of the best public health systems in the world, and had amazing statistics in terms of not just longevity, but also births and cures and fantastic biopharmaceutical industry that produced drugs and curatives and all that kind of stuff. That's pretty much gone. It's pretty much gone. And the images that we have seen in the last year of patients in hospitals and COVID treatments have been very, very distressing. Right in the middle of all these, and as I said, in no particular order, I have put the US embargo, because it is very important to recognize that the crisis is not only internal to Cuba. It's not only because, it is because, but it's not only because of the communist state, of that entrenched authoritarianism, of the economic hardships the country is going through. Some of those hardships have become harsher because of the embargo, because the embargo makes it nearly impossible for Cuba to import. It makes it impossible for Cuba to obtain credit. When we're talking about a country that doesn't have a lot of access to foreign currency, that is just like a double whammy, right? So the embargo's impact on the Cuban economy is real. But, and here is where it becomes even more interesting, it also serves as an excuse for the Cuban government. Because whenever anything goes wrong, whenever anything protests, whenever anything happens, it's the embargo. Obviously, it's because of the embargo, right? So it's not because of us. It's not because this government is failing. It's because the embargo doesn't allow us to do what we would normally do. Visible governmental corruption at the highest levels is also very significant. I mean, you have a governmental elite that looks very well fed and drives around in very fancy cars, and the children of that elite boast about it on social media. And that really, it hurts. And last but not least, and this perhaps should have been up in the top, is what we have seen during these protests is a basic lack of respect for human rights, the kind of human rights, freedom of speech, freedom to protest, peacefully protest, and all that. So here we are. It's been about a week of protests, of the most unprecedented demonstrations in the past 60 years that we have seen in Cuba, where the people of Cuba went out into the streets, openly calling the country, the government, a dictatorship, moving into literally uncharted territory, right? It's culmination of 3 decades of reform that seem to have not really accomplished much other than entrench the kind of controlled semi-capitalist initiatives that the government itself controls, right? So it's government-controlled capitalism. There's lots of anger, and there's multi-generational disappointment with the lack of change. The government's response, the Cuban government's response to date, and actually there were some statements that I just read, at about 3 p.m. and I didn't have time to build them back into the PowerPoint, from the Cuban authorities that continue with what has been their response to any kind of protest. It's all mercenaries. It's all paid by USAID and US money for designed to topple the Cuban government, regime change initiatives. All the social media posts were done by bots generated out of Miami and or other parts of the world, and it's all fake. It's all a lie. The protests have been peaceful, and the government's response to the protests have been peaceful as well, is what they claim. It is undoubtedly true that there were a lot of bots. Now, where they were created, I don't know. And there's a bit of misuse of a hashtag that was originally created for humanitarian aid, which is called SOS, hashtag SOS Cuba, and or hashtag SOS Matanzas, where COVID is really um, um, causing a lot of problems right now. It's been a huge surge. And then those were taken over by political moves. So now, now we in the US, right, we have Biden as president, who promised to carefully review Cuba policy when he took office. And needless to say, he's had other priorities. And I am not putting anything on Biden saying, you should have done this earlier, because, COVID, infrastructure, the economy, and he's got a lot of issues. And Cuba was not at that point on the top of the list of issues to be addressed. But I would love to have a conversation with you all about what you think we, the US, should do in response to what's been going on. So I would like to take this opportunity to open up for questions and for chatting. And I'm going to stop sharing so I can see people. There we go.
Well, Professor Lopez, thank you so much. This could not have been more timely, which, just happened this way because this was actually rescheduled from a couple of weeks ago. So thank you so much. We have had a couple questions come in the chat. Rebecca Bostic asks, in what manner did the currency reform moving to a single currency result in inflation?
Any product that is imported, which was which had been sold in stores, which only accepted payment for a long time in what is like the tourist currency, which was called the CUC, the convertible currency, immediately became very expensive because one CUC, which is roughly one CUC, which is roughly equivalent to $1, roughly, was equivalent to 26 pesos. So if a banana, well, not a banana, that's not a good example. If a bottle of olive oil was 7 CUC, and I hate multiplying by 7, I should not have picked 7, but all of a sudden it became more than 300 pesos, okay? And 300 pesos is what a normal working class Cuban makes in 1 month. Now there was some salary adjustments, so those salaries went up a little bit, but it's all been very slow and the inflation is tremendous.
So somebody wrote in that they have been writing with a number of Cuban detained asylum seekers during the presidential election, and the majority had indicated that they hoped that Trump would have won. And what are your thoughts about that? Like, why do you think that's the case?
Make Cuba great again. There's tremendous identification with that posture that we had something great and we've lost it. And it's really a posture, right? As we can argue in America. There's a kind of, if you think about, okay, so some people may not agree with me, which is fine, you can tell me. But if you think about sort of like the mythology of Fidel Castro, here's this really strong male figure that on his shoulders is going to carry this country forward. And it's because of his will and his tenacity and his refusal to allow anyone to prove him wrong that he will persevere. Does that sound like anyone we know? Anyone else we know? Right? So there's tremendous identification with just the figure of Trump himself. I don't think there's a lot of discussion of the details of foreign policy in these contexts. And there is also the belief, which goes against all reason, that if you starve the Cuban people, they will rise and change will come. Now, it's been 62 years that we've tried to do that, and it's failed every single time. Does this prove that starving them is going to be successful? I don't think so. I mean, successful in regime change. I personally don't think so. I mean, if we look at how regimes have changed, if they have changed successfully over history, we look at Central Europe, for example, right? That part of the Soviet Union, which we now refer to as Central Europe. in those countries, regime change came about because of what had become a rising middle class that was demanding the change. It wasn't because the downtrodden were starving, right? It was a very different kind of political climate and political demands that were being made. And I actually think that the direction that Obama was going was building the beginnings of such a middle class in Cuba, a class of entrepreneurs who were thriving, who were beginning to thrive, who were beginning to do very well through tourism, particularly, but also small enterprises. So that's a long answer, but it's, it's a very complicated question.
Yeah, and I think the tourism question is interesting, right? People are excited. This is, you know, part of our travel series, and people are excited to start traveling again. What do you think the impact of some of the recent unrest will have on the ability to travel to Cuba and your future plans for travel?
It's still unknown. It's still an unknown to me. I mean, quite frankly, as I said, I've gone to Cuba. I don't know. Somebody put in the registration list, you know, it's like, how many times have you been to Cuba? Question. And I was trying to figure it out. So I did a rough count. I think I've been to Cuba at least 50 times, but probably more. It's been 35 years of going, 37 years of going to Cuba. So I don't know anybody personally that wants to go to Cuba this weekend. It's not from a traditional, from a typical tourist perspective, you know, it is not the kind of experience one would be excited to go through. I mean, it's like, well, we think of Cuba as tourists, you know, we think of beaches, we think of music, we think maybe of baseball, we think of cigars, we think of rum, very fun things, all the things that make tourism to Cuba great. We don't think of, you know, running into a street protest and having to hide so that we don't get hit by the police or taken away, or, you know, someone might think that we're Cuban, and well, I am. I mean, I was born there. I look Cuban. Those kinds of experiences. So from my perspective, I'm not going there any time in the near future. And I don't know any tourists that are going to be very happy. And beyond the political situation, which I actually personally, I think it will be smoothed over quite a bit. And in fact, there hasn't been anything for a couple of days now. It's quieted down. But also COVID is out of control. I mean, if we look at some figures of total COVID numbers, there are a lot of countries that have done worse proportionally. Cuba's a small country, but it's still really bad for Cuba, because Cuba has always been able to maintain, as an authoritarian regime, it has always been able to maintain very strict public safety controls. And this time it's escaped them for many reasons, some of them economic, right? If you have to go stand online for 2 hours to get a ration of something, it is very unlikely that you're going to be socially distanced. And everybody seems to be masking, but the social distancing and just congregating with people for that amount of time, it's not good. I mean, remember how when we went into lockdown, I mean, I don't think I left my house at one point for like 2 weeks at a time. You just do one supermarket run and make it last. And if you didn't have it, you substitute it. The Cubans can't do that, right? They also have tremendous difficulty building up their capacity of vaccines. They've developed their own vaccines, which are apparently, they say, quite effective. They have 2, but they don't have syringes. They lack a lot of the stuff that they need to mass produce the vaccines or to deliver them to the people. So COVID is not going to go away anytime soon. And that in and of itself is, you know, a tremendous detriment to travel. So I just don't see the tourism industry picking up again. They had started allowing some Russian tourists to come to the island, to Varadero, to the beaches near Matanzas, and that is believed to be what led to the huge surge in Matanzas. So I don't see them opening up either.
Do you think that some of the recent openings for humanitarian help and escape valves similar to Mariel or El Canazo? I'm not sure I understand that question, but you may.
I mean, could you repeat it?
Yeah,
Isn't
and is the recent opening to receive humanitarian help and escape valve similar to Mariel or El Melizicano?
It is not very clear how much humanitarian help we can actually give Cuba at this point. I know of some initiatives, but to deliver the help that has been gathered, I know one person personally. I mean, I know one individual personally who actually took all the stuff that she and her partner had gathered and went to Spain to be able to take it from Spain to Cuba because they could not get permission from the US to travel with that stuff to Cuba, nor could they get permission from Cuba to bring all the stuff in. So it's not good on either side. Mm-hmm. So I don't know how much of an opening for humanitarian aid there really is.
Switching topics a little bit, somebody mentioned that several years ago that there were some excellent Cuban artists that were doing really well. How are they doing now? How has the artistic community been affected by all this?
The artistic communities that impacted by all these things that I've been talking about, the economic hardships, the power outages, the food shortages, COVID, as any other group. They're still there, but film production comes to almost a standstill because you can't, like it did here, right? You can't shoot a movie when you're in lockdown. Writers, artists, poets, you know, being a poet is a job in Cuba. That always makes me laugh, right? You can make a living as a poet just by being a poet, by writing your poetry. It's so lovely. You know, they're getting their salaries, but they're like anybody else, they have to go stand in lines. And I know some very high ranking Cuban cultural officials, right? I mean, not high ranking, not at the level of ministers, but people who run presses or institutes for culture who have to go stand in line and see what they can get for the day, right? And that just takes away, well, a lot of time, a lot of effort, creates a lot of fear, COVID fear. In Havana, they have started doing lockdowns instead of locking down the whole city. So as not to paralyze the city, they lock down by neighborhoods, or they even lock down by buildings. If they have evidence that there have been 3 or 4 cases in a building, they will lock the building down. These are ways that they're trying to go more granular in terms of containment, because locking down the city, people don't have reserves, right? And there is no infrastructure to do the kind of entrepreneurial thing that emerged here in New Orleans. Is the only lockdown I've ever experienced. You know, where all of a sudden there were delivery services for those who could afford them. That doesn't exist. So
as we're talking about some of this dissent, do you see it different between the generations on the island? Somebody had asked about like social media users versus the national TV narrators.
No, absolutely. National TV has a narrative, the narrative that all's well. These were all peaceful demonstrations. And as always, the Cuban government is peaceful and our police is very well trained and very peaceful. But it's through social media that we've seen lots of things that convince me that that's not quite honest, right? That's not quite the truth. President Miguel Díaz-Canel actually came out on Sunday, it was either Sunday or Monday, in the first days of all this, and came on national television saying, it's time for the people to rise up against these protesters, sort of like asking the people themselves to go out and do what, right? Protest back? When that has happened in the past, that happened during the Mariel Exodus, when people were trying to get into the embassy of Peru and then waiting for the boat lift. That same call was made out to the population, and that led to what was known as actos de repudio, where if somebody in your neighborhood learned that you were on the list to leave the country, they started protesting against you violently, you know, throwing eggs at your house, throwing rocks at your house, insults, constant, for example, banging on doors and windows, bringing in loudspeakers so you couldn't sleep, just essentially torturing you. And those literally were, you know, like neighborhood associations that were doing that. To my knowledge, that has not happened, that I know, that I have seen on social media. And perhaps some of you have seen differently. Carolina, I know you're my big interlocutor in all these things. Have you seen anything on social media that there have been any kind of actos de repudio?
Yeah, a little bit. I've seen a little bit. I think primarily on the first day, a group of the same artists that kind of, some of the same artists and intellectuals that protested in that picture from the New York Times went to the television and radio building on La Rampa.
Oh, that one. You're right.
And there was a group of people that surrounded them and started shouting them down. And so, yeah, a little bit. There's been echoes of that.
Oh, that footage. But Carolina, that footage, they had cars and trucks into which they put the people that they took off the steps. Who has a big truck like that in Cuba as a citizen? Nobody. They didn't look like regular citizens to me. I know there's a couple of women that were going like this, right? That I thought looked like regular people, but the men who were actually doing the carrying of the people looked official, even though they were not in uniform. And you're right. I mean, that's the only instance that I have seen too, but I kind of put it out of my mind because I didn't believe it.
Is this the moment that the US, EU, OAS, UN should be convening to start a process to coordinate humanitarian relief and peaceful discussion of political and economic reforms in Cuba? Has it come to that yet? Are we there?
Oh, I think we're totally there.
I think it'll happen.
No, totally. I think the most effective thing that the US can do right now would be most productive in terms to leading to the necessary infrastructure for social change in Cuba, social and economic change in Cuba, is to open up the embargo, if not lift it. Lifting it takes an act of Congress, and to get an act of Congress on this issue, we'll put it this way, I don't think I'll live to see that day, but doing some of the tweaking of all the tightening of the embargo that was done by Trump, removing those tweaks, opening things back up again, would be the most destabilizing thing for the government, for the government core, right? Not for the people of Cuba. It will help the people of Cuba. If what we care about is the people of Cuba, that's the way to do it. Humanitarian aid it's pitiful, right? Cubans are very proud people. They don't want humanitarian aid. They want to have the opportunity to work and to thrive through their work and through their achievements and to have hopes, right? They don't want to receive alms. That's insulting.
Well, I think there's hopefully a lot that we can do to continue to support the people of Cuba through this difficult time. We've seen it here in the US, and we know how support of our neighboring nations is helpful to us. But we do want to say thank you to you, Professor Lopez, for your time and sharing these insights with us again, so unbelievably timely. And for those of you who are excited about travel again, our trips to Cuba may be a little bit delayed, but there's lots of other exciting Tulane travel trips. So we hope you'll check those out on our website and join us again for another virtual travel lecture in the future.
No, and I do hope that trip to Cuba that you all have planned can happen. And I'll tell you, I mean, I'd be very happy to join you.
In the spring, I think we have a scheduled trip to Cuba, and you are scheduled to join us. So hopefully that will be happening.
Right.
We all hope so. I'm happy to go too. Let's all go to Cuba.
All right, let's do it.
All right.